Den islamiske verden er udemokratisk, præget af krig, terror, manglende uddannelse, svage økonomi og undertrykkelse af kvinder og minoriteter. Ja, grunden det er hverken vestlig kolonialisme, amerikansk imperialisme eller racisme. Tallene og den nyeste forskning viser derimod, at den sørgelige tilstand skyldes de fundamentalistiske strømninger i islam, der i de seneste årtier har fået stadig større udbredelse. Ja, det mener i hvert fald vores gæst i dag. Han er født i Holland, han er professor i sociologi og migrationsforskning ved Humboldt-universitetet i Berlin, og så er han leder af Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin für Sozialforschung og en af de absolut førende eksperter inden for sit felt. Og så har han skrevet bogen Islams forfaldne hus, som netop er udkommet på dansk på forlaget Presto. Welcome to you, Mr. Ruud Koopmans.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
We are very pleased. First of all, in your introduction, you write that the Islamic culture is the Sputnik of our time. That is a description that you use. Could you describe what you mean by that?
Well, I don't say exactly the Islamic culture. I said Islam nowadays can be considered the Sputnik of our times, in the sense that if you look at the history of Islam, currently the Islamic world is in quite a sorry state if you compare it to other parts of the world. But this wasn't always the case. In its first couple of hundred years, the Islamic civilization was certainly not lagging behind the West, and in many respects was even more advanced than the Western world. And in that sense, you can see the problems of the Islamic world as one of stagnation, a culture that was formerly progressive for its times, has started lagging behind the rest of the world more and more. And in that sense, you can compare it sort of to the Sputnik or to the Trabant, technological inventions of the former communist bloc that in the time that they were invented, in the 1950s, were very modern and to some extent more advanced than the West at the time. But because communism was a system that was incapable of transforming itself and of adapting to changing times over time, it stagnated and never got any further than the Sputnik Trabant stage. And that is a bit also what happened to the Islamic world.
Yes, and especially within the last around 40 years, there seems to have been this gradual decline and radicalization in the Islamic world. Of course, it's all very well laid out in your book, but nevertheless, I'm going to ask you, what is it that has prompted this development?
Well, this development has deeper roots, of course, which lie in this stagnation and decline, relative decline of the Islamic world, which became very painfully felt by Muslims after the First World War, when the last Islamic empire, the Ottoman Empire, fell apart completely, was carved up by colonial powers, and only the rump state of what is now Turkey remains. And this was perceived all across the Muslim world as a very painful humiliation, and it prompted the question, what could be done to regain the former glory of the Muslim world? And one answer was modernization by people like Ataturk or the Shahs of Persia, who tried to imitate the West, but did so very selectively. They did not copy democracy, for instance, and human rights. A second answer was religious fundamentalism, the idea that, a very utopian idea, that if Muslims would go back to the original days of the Muslim world, would live again like the Prophet Muhammad did, and would follow to the letter the prescriptions of the Quran and the Hadiths, then also their former glory would be restored. And initially this modernist answer of Ataturk, etc., was the dominant answer, but as that answer more and more disappointed, also because of the defeats of the Arab countries in the wars against Israel, the fundamentalist answer got more and more support and came to a breakthrough in the revolutionary year 1979, when three very important events occurred in the Muslim world that I describe at length in the book. Of course, the first one that most people know is the Iranian Revolution, where Khomeini came to power. The second important event was the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, which they did to support a communist regime there that had come under attack from Islamist rebels. And the third event, the least well known of them, but maybe the most important one of them, was an occupation by a couple of hundred Islamic jihadists of the Great Mosque in Mecca, so the holiest place of the Muslim world. And they demanded the resignation of the Saudi monarchy and that all foreign troops would leave the Arabian Peninsula. The Saudi regime was faced with an important dilemma how to deal with this, because you could not just invade the holiest place of Islam. So they needed permission from the ulama, the religious scholars in Saudi Arabia. And they got that permission also, but also on a condition, namely that they would strengthen the rule of Sharia in Saudi Arabia, and they would invest money in the spread of Salafi Wahhabism, the state religion in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the world. And then the uprising was crushed with the help of the French and the Pakistani, and Saudi Arabia since then has indeed been exporting its very radical version of Islam across the Muslim world, of course helped with billions of oil dollars. And it did so in competition with Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia were very much in competition. There were two types of fundamentalism that sort of were waging a proxy war all across the world to show that they were the most staunch defenders of the Islamist ideals.
But one of the points that you make in the book, and rather convincingly, I think, is that because one could say that Wahhabism isn't a new ideology. Of course, it's not as old as Islam is itself, but the House of Saud has been ruling Saudi Arabia for quite some time. But there is this connection between a growth in wealth, that there seems to be this natural resource financed wealth that you've seen in Saudi Arabia, and the rise of both fundamentalism, but also a lack of democracy. There is this connection.
There are multiple connections. One connection is that oil, of course, helps authoritarian regimes more generally to stay in power. That's not just true for Islamic authoritarian regimes, but it's also true for Russia, for instance, currently, or Venezuela. So, because with regimes that can draw their income from natural resources, they are not dependent on the support of their population. They can finance a big military and police apparatus that can suppress any opposition, etc. So that's one mechanism. But more importantly, in this case, these oil revenues fell in the hands of countries and regimes that were strongly oriented towards fundamentalism. Wahhabism, as you correctly say, dates back to the 18th century. So this idea was there, but it was an idea limited to a few nomadic tribes in the middle of the desert. So it didn't have much impact on the rest of the world. But when these nomadic tribes all of a sudden became ultra rich and had billions of dollars to spend on spreading their gospel across the world, that was of course a big game changer. And that was not just Saudi Arabia, it was also Iran that had these oil revenues. It was also the Gulf states, the Emirates and Qatar, and these countries are still involved in many of the conflicts that are raging in the Islamic world right now. The war in Libya, the war in Yemen, for instance, all of them were in one way or another involved in the financing of various terrorist groups, because there's a competition between all these regimes ongoing, and that's in the nature of religious fundamentalism. Is that, of course, they hate non-believers, but they hate each other at least as much, because there's a lot of ideological infighting, of course, between Sunnis and Shiites, between Wahhabites and other forms of fundamentalism, the Brotherhood, for instance. So many of the conflicts that are raging in the Islamic world are conflicts between different fractions in the fundamentalist camp.
When you look at what is the title of your book is Islams forfaldne hus, the desolate house of Islam, or and that's oriented towards the the Muslim world. But if we look at the diaspora, the immigrants in Europe, how is the fundamentalism present here?
Well, as for any immigrant group, of course, also for Muslim immigrants in Western countries and in Europe, it is true that the values and the types of norms and behaviors that are prevalent in the country of origin are to some extent also mirrored in the countries of immigration. Certainly in the first generation, they bring that cultural and religious baggage along with them. That as such was in the past often not such a problem, because in the past migration meant cutting much of the ties with the region of origin because of large distances, even in the time in more modern times, very high costs of telecommunication, for instance. When I moved from the Netherlands to Germany, for instance, calling my mother in the Netherlands would cost me something like 1 Deutschmark per minute. So I kept it very limited. So that's completely changed now, of course, with satellite TV, with internet, with very cheap flights. The ties between regions and countries of origin and immigrant communities are very tight, and the governments and also the religious authorities of these countries of origin are also trying to use and strengthen the grip they have on immigrant communities. And that means that the problems of violent conflicts, the problems of religious fundamentalism and intolerance that are prevalent in the Islamic world, that they also have an impact on these Islamic communities here.
But what would be the root causes, or not the root causes, but the present day causes of that causes radicalization within the Muslim immigration groups today? What is because I know that you described that fundamentalism doesn't seem to be decreasing over the generations, but actually in some cases increasing?
No, not increasing, it's slightly decreasing, okay. but very modestly so. Not so quickly as you would hope. The root causes of radicalization here in Europe lie in the Middle East and in Pakistan and in the countries of origin. It's the radicalization there that spills over to the European situation. Of course, it can be exacerbated by domestic conditions to the extent that integration does not succeed sufficiently, and Muslim groups live in segregated communities which have little contact with the majority society. Then, of course, such hostile images of outgroup members, of non-Muslims, can be sustained. And that is unfortunately the case in many immigration countries, that there is a high degree of segregation, partly because of rejection by the majority society and discrimination, partly also by the fact that especially religiously conservative Muslims do not want to intermingle with the majority society because they want to stay within their own group. They want to have contact only with other believing Muslims, for instance, because of the rejection of mixed gender forms of socializing, which makes it very difficult for Orthodox Muslims to have contact with non-Muslims or even with secular Muslims. And that segregation, of course, makes it easier for regimes and for radical preachers from Turkey and from the countries of the Middle East to influence people here in these segregated Muslim communities.
But I think that the argument in Denmark from at least some parts of the left wing of the political spectrum would be that, well, these people have gone to Danish kindergartens, Danish primary schools, and so on. They have been saturated in Danish culture, so that these kind of parallel societies would be an impossibility. They shouldn't be able to exist, but apparently.
Yeah, but that is wildly overestimating the power of assimilation of kindergartens and schools. Of course, that is important, but I think in Denmark it will be true as much as in other European countries that partly the school system and the kindergarten system are also segregated, so that Muslim kids often go to schools and kindergartens in which there are many other Muslim or at least other immigrant kids, so that even the amount of contact that they have with native Danes in school, in kindergarten, or in the neighborhoods and in the playground will be relatively limited. And if then Orthodox religiosity comes on top of it and, for instance, makes socializing more difficult. Just imagine, and I'm not inventing, I mean, I have experienced such stories myself. Your son has a Muslim friend in school, but he cannot come to the house of your Muslim friend because the Muslim friend also has sisters, and the family doesn't want my son from outside the family to be in the same house with the sisters of his friend, so it doesn't happen. And in a similar way, it doesn't happen that an Orthodox Muslim family and another family will get together for a birthday party or a garden party, or, you know, there are many ways of socializing that just don't happen because of this large cultural distance.
One of the things that you mentioned, I seem to recall that it's regarding German schools, was that there can actually be some kind of instances of some kind of reverse integration where, for example, anti-Semitism, I think is the example, is more prevalent in schools with a high degree of Muslim students than it would be in, because it seems to, the anti-Semitism seems to rub on to the German students?
This was a study from Belgium, actually,
okay.
Where a colleague of mine, Mark Gardas, also a sociologist, has done extensive research, among other things, on anti-Semitism. And indeed, he found out that not only was anti-Semitism much more widespread among Muslim school pupils, and we're talking also about the legitimation of violence against Jews. About 1/5 of young Muslims found that it was okay to use violence against Jews. It's not really little, and also it's also a non-negligible part, by the way, of non-Muslims found that. So anti-Semitism is certainly not limited to Muslims. But the interesting thing was indeed that in schools where there were many Muslims, also the non-Muslim kids would be more anti-Semitic, because it becomes like a social norm in a school also to use Jew as a curse word. To be called a Jew is that you're some kind of bad person, and that's not uncommon in certain schools, and that I know from Germany as well.
In your book, you describe the treatment of women in a number of Islamic countries as, and I quote, Islamic apartheid, which some would seem as a rather harsh term. Do you really think that's a valid parallel?
I think so, because apartheid means that there are different laws applying to different groups of people, and that in the public sphere some places are reserved for one group and some places are reserved for another. So there are basically benches or cafes, which in South Africa apartheid were only for whites, or they were only for blacks. And in Muslim societies the same happens with regard to gender. There are many places where women cannot go.
But I think many viewers would probably think that, well, if they went to Istanbul on vacation and they didn't really see or observe any public segregation in any way or form, and so that at least large swaths of the Muslim world would not be focused on this kind of gender apartheid, at least not in the public sphere?
Well, not in all countries and not in all parts of all countries. But if you travel to smaller towns in Turkey, you will find that in many of the restaurants there is also a separate so-called family room, which is the only place where women are supposed to go. So that's where the families are. They are mixed, and the other part is just for men. It doesn't say banned for women, but the message is clear. There's a general part, and then there's the aile, the family part.
Okay. You mention you describe how you yourself participated in the anti-apartheid protests in the 80s, and this saw Nelson Mandela speaking in, I think it was Amsterdam, but and was very moved by it. And then you write that there is this stark difference between the attitudes towards the oppression of the black population in South Africa among left and progressives vis-a-vis how they perceive the oppression of women, whereas there was a lot of noise and boycotts and so on in regards to South Africa, but not much is being mentioned about what is happening in the Islamic world. What do you think that there is this major discrepancy?
Yeah, well, there's indeed a lot of hypocrisy in the debate about Islam or about politics more generally. It's not limited to this case, of course. If you look at the history of solidarity movements, whether on the right or on the left, it tends to be highly selective. In the past, the right was very preoccupied with the dissidents in the Eastern Bloc countries, but they didn't care about what's happening in Chile or in South Africa. Whereas on the left, it was completely the reverse. They didn't care much about the oppression in the Eastern Bloc, but they did care about Vietnam or Chile, whatever. So there is a tendency in politics to appropriate the causes of suffering people elsewhere in the world for one's own domestic, parochial political games, to try to score points against the political opponent. And for that reason, then it's not interesting, of course, to be as a left progressive person to be critical of Islamic regimes which are perceived by them to be at least partly on their side, because they tend to be anti-American, they tend to be anti-Israel. So there's a very parochial interpretation, and that's something that I find as somebody who identifies himself as progressive and left, I find that extremely disappointed in my left-wing brethren. I think that everybody, every suffering human being and everybody who suffers from human rights abuses deserves our support just as much, and we cannot be more critical and give more attention to some forms just because they happen to fit our political left-right scheme, and just because they are a nice fodder for political fights with my political opponent in my own Danish parliament or something. No, that's not the way in which I would like to see these topics approached, and that's why also one of the main reasons why I've written this book, to point out the terrible oppression and suffering that is going on in the Muslim world, and to point out that ignoring that is actually not being solidary and preoccupied with the fate of Muslims at all, because Muslims are the ones who suffer most under fundamentalism. It is Muslim minorities or Muslims who think differently, Muslims who are secular, who want reform within Islam, women within the Muslim communities, apostates, intellectuals, etc. They are the ones who suffer. Plus, of course, also non-Muslim minorities such as Christians who live in the Middle East, who also deserve our solidarity, and where we also see that not just the left, but even Christian Democrats in Europe are very, very hesitant to mobilize attention for the suffering of Christians in other parts of the world, and especially in the Middle East. And I ask myself why. I know why, because they think that is somehow that is somehow racist, or it's somehow not done to be solidary with other Christians, because, oh no, it's much easier politically to be solidary with exotic groups that are different from yourself. But what do I care whether it's a Christian or a Muslim that is killed because of his beliefs? It should be equally valid, but it isn't in the political debate.